Today for our talk. My name is Jessica. I'm one of the archivists here at the National Records of Scotland. We're not expecting a fire alarm today, so if the alarm does sound, just follow one of the members of staff down back to the front door where you came through. And I would like to ask you to put your phones on silent if that's possible. Thank you. So today our talk is entitled 200 Years of Football in Edinburgh. And our speaker today is Andy Mitchell. Andy is a sports historian and researcher who has published numerous books and articles. He spent 10 years as head of communications at the Scottish FA and 20 years as media officer for UEFA. He was a research consultant to the Netflix series The English Game and has been a consultant for the FIFA World Cup Museum. He was also on the selection panel for the Scottish Sports Hall of Fame and the board of the Museum of International Rugby. Today, he is here to speak about the world's first known organisation dedicated to football, which was founded by John Hope in December 1824. So it's its 200th anniversary in this month. So he has spent meticulous time going through the archives that we hold here. We hold the John Hope collection, which is an extensive personal archive. And the talk will explore the organisation's origins, its members, and most importantly, its legacy, firmly placing it in the pantheon of association football heritage. So I'd like to hand over to Andy just now. Thank you.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks very much for coming along today to celebrate the 200th anniversary, the 200th birthday of the world's first football club. So whether you're here in person or virtually on YouTube, I hope you enjoyed today's talk. The football club was established in Edinburgh precisely 200 years ago this month in December 1824. But although it may have been the first club, don't worry, we're not going to break into a rousing chorus of football's coming home, because there are many homes of football. And despite the strident claims of places like Sheffield, London, Cambridge, or even Glasgow, people have been playing versions of football for hundreds, if not thousands of years, around Britain and around the world, in all sorts of nations and cultures. Those games of football ranged from gentle court entertainment to essentially urban warfare. And the word football was very widely open to local interpretation. But they all had one thing in common, and that they fed into the web that eventually created the modern game of football. A process of evolution that came to a head in the 19th century as football was codified and standardized, enabling it to eventually become the world game. So in my talk today, I'll explain what led to the football club being founded and why it was in Edinburgh. I'll describe how and where they played, who the players were, and the challenges that they faced. And finally, I'll outline some links between the game that they played in the 1820s and 1830s and the modern game of association football. Having said that, I'm well aware that some historians dispute the club's relevance to association football, suggesting that it was just a quirk of history. But I believe the football club, founded in 1824, played an important role in the development of sport. So listen up and decide for yourself. So how did we get here? I'm sure most people will be familiar with the formation of the Football Association in London in 1863, which marked essentially the split between rugby and football. So the great divide between the kicking game and the carrying game. But that wasn't the starting point in itself. It was more like the end of the beginning. Because before 1863, and even for a while afterwards, there was no common agreement on how football should be played, as every town, every school had its own traditions and understandings. So you can read quite widely about the various attempts to agree on a code of football, whether that was at Cambridge University in the 1840s or within the vibrant football culture in Sheffield from the 1850s, or the heated debates in the early 1860s that led to the founding of the FA in London. But before any of that happened, right here in the capital, a football club was thriving in Edinburgh in the 1820s with their own set of rules. Often when I tell people this, the first thing I'm asked is, what was the club called? And because they were unique and the first, appropriately enough, their name was simply the Football Club. And the second question I'm asked is what kind of football they played. Was it rugby or soccer? But the members wouldn't have understood that question because their brand of football was simply the one they had played since childhood. Basically, a vigorous game where a ball was kicked by two teams between two goals. Principles which, of course, we recognize to this day. So the club was founded in 1824 by a student called John Hope, together with his friends, and it remained active for 17 years. And in that time, hundreds of young men joined up as members, which means they were playing regular, organized football in Edinburgh decades before the Football Association was founded. However, the football club didn't really make waves at the time, and in fact, it kept such a low profile that the club is mentioned just once in the newspapers of the day, and that was about a club dinner. There were no match reports because it was a closed club and there was no one to play against. They never advertised for players. None of its members wrote about it in their memoirs. And there are not even any team photos because photography hadn't been invented yet. So the club might even have been lost to history, but thankfully John Hope was an obsessive hoarder. And he filed away almost every scrap of paper during his life, an accumulation which by the time of his death amounted to well over 200 boxes. Those boxes were stored after his death by a succession of conscientious Edinburgh lawyers, all working in his old office in Murray Place, and eventually they were deposited by the Hope Trust in this very building, the National Records of Scotland. And it was here that the football club was essentially rediscovered in the 1990s by Dr. Neil Tranter of Stirling University, who had to wade through mountains of uncatalogued papers, some of which hadn't been touched for 100 years. Thankfully, they have now been digitized. But the upshot is that John Hope's football club papers represent an archive of immense historical significance, one which few other sporting organizations can emulate. For example, there's no equivalent archive for Rangers or Celtic or Manchester United or Arsenal, whatever. So today is all about understanding how this came about. So to begin with, it's important to appreciate that organized sport for adults has been in Edinburgh's DNA from the earliest times. And the city has much more of a sporting pedigree than many people realize. Way back in the 16th century, for example, games for bodily exercise were actually promoted for students at Edinburgh University, so long as they didn't give an excuse for missing lectures or lead to drinking or gambling. In the 1590s, the university had its own playing field, and the students were taken there for supervised games. Moving on to 18th century Edinburgh, sport for well-to-do adult men became socially acceptable and grew in popularity as they sought to enjoy outdoor recreation in the company of like-minded others. And that helps to explain why this city gave birth to some of the world's earliest sporting clubs, in golf, in bowls, in gymnastics. And club members then wrote the first known rules for golf, bowls, curling, because those rules enabled the clubs to hold competitions, to award trophies and medals, and organize all the social activities associated with that. Sport really became part of middle-class life in the 18th century. And people here built up quite a considerable experience of forming clubs, managing membership, and writing rules. Moving on to the early 19th century, the city saw a kind of marked increase in more vigorous sports, athletic recreations like cricket, racket sports, fencing, quoiting, skating. The Scotsman newspaper commented in 1823, gymnastic exercises seemed to be growing into credit here. So they'd noticed this pattern of activity. But at that point, the list of popular activities for adults in the city didn't include football, which was essentially seen as belonging to the schoolyard, the playground. That was about to change. Certainly football was already well established for boys at the high school in Edinburgh. And for example, Sir Walter Scott, who was educated there in the 1780s, made no secret of his love of football. And some of his contemporaries also recalled playing the game there. In the high school yards, it's the playground at the front of the building, there was essentially a hard surface which was confined by stone walls. So the type of football that they played in their free time was a kicking rather than a carrying game, because if you're carrying, that leads to full body tackling, and if you did that in that kind of environment, that would lead to injury or certainly damage to your clothing. And the same principle applied to other schools with similar environments, such as the urban public schools in England. And if you want to check it out, those schoolyards are still there in their original layout. It's now part of Edinburgh University's Climate Change Institute. But you can walk around and experience what it would be like to kick a ball around 200 years ago. However, once the boys left the high school, generally they stopped playing football, because apart from the obvious work and family responsibilities, there was a very pragmatic barrier to carrying on. Where could they play? As in many big cities, the public parks in Edinburgh were very limited at that time, and even those that did exist, like Bruntsfield Links or Leith Links, where the golfers played, were still pretty rough, hilly areas which had not yet been flattened. The meadows, which famously became the nursery for Hearts and Hibs in their early days, weren't laid out for recreation until the 1850s. And any flat or open grassy areas within Edinburgh were generally used as pasture for cows and sheep or for domestic chores like drying clothes. Even playing in the street was illegal, as detailed in the Edinburgh police regulations. So finding space for active sports and recreation was quite a challenge, and it was John Hope who came up with the solution after he left school and went up to the university. He rented a field at Dalry, which was then just beyond the western city limits, and paid enough money to compensate the owner for keeping it clear of grazing animals. He then went out and commissioned a ball, which was a bit harder than just going to your local sports shop. It was a handmade leather cover, which would be inflated with a pig's bladder. And he also bought and commissioned painted wooden poles to use as goalposts. Altogether, that meant it was a fairly expensive undertaking, as we can read in the club accounts. So to cover the cost, he invited his friends to subscribe in his new club, and they jumped at the privilege, paying £1 and 6 each to join in. And the football club players met for the very first time on Saturday, 11th December 1824. Now, let's take a look at John Hope, the instigator of the club, who was only 17 years old. He was born in Edinburgh in 1807, the son of a lawyer. He was educated at the high school, but not exactly a star pupil. His biographer admitted, his mind was not of the sparkling order. He was a steady, plodding worker who did not dazzle with meteoric brilliance. Obviously an ideal lawyer, because that's what he became. He duly went to work for his father, spent a couple of years at Edinburgh University studying law, didn't graduate, and followed in his father's footsteps as a writer to the Signet, which is a prestigious society of legal professionals. He lived his entire life in Edinburgh's New Town, which really was new at that time, with his childhood in Queen Street, and then as an adult in Murray Place. It was very much an Edinburgh establishment middle-class life. In time, as the eldest son, and with a couple of rich uncles who died, he became extremely wealthy and devoted his fortune and his boundless energy to causes that he believed in. Now, John Hope wasn't just a footballer. He was an influential character in 19th century Edinburgh life in many fields. A social reformer, a philanthropist, an environmental campaigner, a town councillor, as well as being a sportsman. It has to be said that by today's standards, some of his beliefs are very bigoted, or at least blinkered. He made frequent and ferocious attacks on popery and Catholicism, and was obsessed with abstinence from alcohol, so much so that he insisted all his staff were teetotal, and even fell out with local churches over their use of wine for communion. He thought it had to be non-alcoholic wine. They didn't always agree. But he was also a passionate social reformer who spoke up for the poor and the downtrodden. For example, he led a campaign to introduce Saturday half holidays. He railed against pollution in the water of Leith. He organised regular excursions in the countryside for thousands of slum kids and paid to provide an education to help them to escape those slums. But most of all, throughout his life, and we'll see examples of this as we go on, he believed in and promoted the benefits of sport, exercise, and fresh air. And for us, he stands out today because he loved football. And in that, John Hope was certainly not alone. The football club papers represent a treasure trove of accounts, receipts, letters, and even a set of fledgling rules. And for those of you in the room today, some of them are on display at the side here, some of the original papers brought out for this talk. And for me, the most fascinating papers within those are the membership lists. And although the records are not quite complete, 1 or 2 years are missing, they record everyone who joined and paid a subscription. Some of the members had a fleeting membership, some came back year after year, and 3 of them were members throughout the club's entire existence. And altogether, in these surviving books, you can find the names of around 300 men as members of the football club. And a key part of the research for the book that I helped to write was to identify them and find out where they came from, what they did with their lives. The early membership lists only give a name, which sometimes presented quite a challenge to find out who they were. But then in the 1830s, they also include an address, which did make it a bit easier. Now, these are the membership numbers season by season. And as you can see, it had a pretty buoyant first 8 years before starting to fall away. And assuming that there was no significant drop in the years that are missing, this was a remarkably consistent membership And although a lot of the members only joined for 1 or 2 years, there was always a steady stream of young men willing to take their place. Then, in 1832, something changed. The numbers halved. Was it a change of fashion, resistance to new rules, an internal dispute, something else? Sadly, we don't know. But the drop in members prompted a rise in the cost of subscription to cover the deficit. And by the end of the decade, the club appears to have become unviable. However, a bit more of that later. Let's have a look at the members themselves. Not surprisingly, their origins were largely within Edinburgh, young men who'd been at the two major schools here. John Hope, of course, was at the high school, as was his father and most of Edinburgh male society at that time in the early 19th century. So there are strong links to the high school, as you'd expect. But the other school, which features very largely in the football club, with at least 56 members educated there, was Edinburgh Academy, which coincidentally is also celebrating its bicentenary this year. Now, the Academy, as you may know, played a crucial role in introducing rugby football to Scotland in the 1850s. Yet this extensive membership of the football club confirms that Academy boys enjoyed football for many years, long before that happened, and it was of the kicking rather than the carrying variety. Beyond that, a significant proportion of the members were schooled further afield. Within Scotland, they came all the way from the borders to the Northern Isles, and many in between. There was also a smattering of English club members. And that can be partially explained because at that time, Oxford and Cambridge universities only accepted Church of England conformists. So students who were non-conformists or Roman Catholics were obliged to seek their university education in Scotland or abroad. Edinburgh was a very popular choice, and one example of that was George Witham, an English Roman Catholic member of the football club in its first 2 years whilst studying medicine here. He'd been educated at Stonyhurst, a Jesuit school in Lancashire, which had its own traditional Shrove Tuesday football game known as the Grand Match. But the bigger picture is that when young men like him came to Edinburgh to study, the fact that they chose to join the football club infers pretty strongly that they must have already played football of some kind at home or at school. So the game was perhaps more widespread than is generally thought right at the start of the 19th century. So where do the members live? And again, there's quite a few clues here. So the membership rules, the membership records include virtually every major street in Edinburgh's new town. If you live in Edinburgh, you'll recognize a lot of these street names. Melville Street, Heriot Row, Murray Place, Alban Place, Drummond Place, and so on. The lesson you can take from this is it's a very strong concentration in one part of Edinburgh in the new town. And in fact, less than 10% of the addresses on record were from outside the new town area. And apart from 3 in the vicinity of the university, none were in the historic Old Town. So already there's a very strong contrast between New Town and Old Town in Edinburgh. What about their occupations? Here are pictures of some of them, obviously taken later in life because photography was not really invented until the 1840s, but although thankfully Edinburgh was a hotbed of pioneering photographers, and several members did have their portraits taken by Hill and Adamson in the 1840s. Now, while most members were students when they joined, almost all of them went on to be professional men, lawyers, doctors, army officers, or into commerce and the church. There's no evidence of occupations such as shopkeepers or clerks, which emphasises further the solidly middle-class background of the members. And given John Hope's professional connections, it's little surprise that over half of the members whose careers have been identified became lawyers. And of those, most of them became writers to the Signet, because Edinburgh then, as now, was very much a city of lawyers. And lawyers then, as now, have the time, the affluence, and the social status to join clubs and indulge in recreations, and maybe even take Wednesday afternoons off to do that. There are also strong connections to medicine, with a number who became prominent surgeons and doctors. One of them was Alexander Wood, who invented the hypodermic syringe. And there were 2 future presidents of the Royal College of Surgeons. And about a dozen members had military connections. Some went into the church, into accountancy, into politics, and a range of careers ranging from indigo planter to wine merchant. So what did they get out of playing football? There is some interesting correspondence among the club papers, albeit largely letters which Hope received rather than those which he sent. Now this one on screen is written in 1825 from Henry Logan, a founding club member who'd just gone to London, saying how much he missed the action. I'm delighted to hear from you so famous an account of the football club. But how could I expect to hear otherwise, as long as it has so active a member to direct it? How I envy you the pleasure you must have had the day there were 39 players out, such kicking of shins and such tumbling. There's another letter from a member who went to Cambridge University in 1828, who effectively said that he didn't see much prospect of football catching on there, which is somewhat ironic given the rule makers of the 1840s at Cambridge, but a further emphasis that Hope's club was ahead of its time. Unfortunately, there isn't very much of John Hope's own impressions of the club, and just one letter written by him which mentions football. He wrote to Thomas Telford, the great road builder, who was a family friend, because he'd stayed with him in 1829 on the way to Europe for the Grand Tour. And he said, "Often have I thought with pleasure on those happy weeks when football was the subject of conversation." So when they visited, even in the south of England, talked about football. So even in those days, when he was away from Edinburgh, John Hope was something of a football obsessive. And moving on to the club itself, let's have some details of its activities. These are rules which John Hope wrote in 1833, very casually on the back of a budget statement. And they represent perhaps the most important single document in the entire archive. Because although brief, and they do leave much to the imagination, these are the world's first known written rules of football. And you could say that this is the earliest attempt at football codification, because they easily predate the Cambridge University rules, the Sheffield rules, and the founding of the Football Association. They're significant both in what they say and what they do not say, which is actually a sentiment echoed in early editions of Rugby School's laws of the 1840s, which said that they were to be regarded as a set of decisions on certain disputed points in football, rather than as containing all the laws of the game, which are too well known to render any explanation necessary. In other words, we all know how the game's played, but this will maybe help to settle any arguments, especially for anyone who's unfamiliar with our kind of football. And if you go through them all one by one, the first 2 rules indicate a concern for safety and a desire to avoid injury. So you could only wear single-soled shoes with no iron and no tripping. Rules 3 and 4 introduce a method of scoring and a defined playing area. So the ball has to pass an imaginary line. And if a free kick, if the ball goes out of bounds. In other words, instead of having a throw in, they'd have a kick in. Rule 5 indicates a controlled amount of physical contact. So pushing is allowed, holding is not illegal, so that's also allowed. But going back to Rule 2, you can't trip or kick people. The meaning of Rule 6 is perhaps less clear, and from the crossings out, it seems that Hope himself was unsure of the best form of words. Allow the ball to be lifted between fields. And that appears to mean that the only time the ball could be handled or picked up was when it had gone out of play, so to bring it back to the field. And underneath he wrote, in brief, a couple of attributes of the game. So affirmative, fun, air, exercise, and negative, no tripping. So overall, this indicates a game between two sides with no handling or running with the ball in your arms. There's physicality, but not aggression. There's a defined playing surface, and the method of scoring was kicking the ball through the goal. So all in all, a strong indication that this was a precursor to what we would recognize as association football rather than the rugby variety. And more about their game can be worked out through the playing equipment, which can be discovered through the receipts, accounts, and letters. And one particularly illuminating part of this is the ball itself. Footballs were made using an imperfect technology which had changed little from medieval times. Basically, an inflated pig's bladder put inside a stitched leather casing. The world's oldest known football, which dates to around 1540, follows this same model, which was simple to make, but notoriously prone to bursting. No India rubber bladders or shop footballs at that point. And this receipt from James Christie and Son, breeches makers and glovers in George Street, shows that if you wanted a football in the 1830s, you had to have it made specially and pay pretty handsomely. The leather case would cost 2 and sixpence or 3 shillings, which is fairly expensive, but at least it was fairly durable, which is more than can be said for the contents. The footballers required a constant supply of fresh pig bladders. And no doubt the city's butchers were more than happy to supply them at 3pence or 6pence each. Unfortunately, the bladders would burst frequently, and a spreadsheet which John Hope kept in 1834 showed that sometimes 4 or 5 bladders would be needed simply to get through one afternoon's play. And overall, there are records for the purchase of 274 bladders in the accounts. In addition, there's all the paraphernalia of ball maintenance, such as little tin pipes for blowing them up, and oil to soften the leather cases. Between games, the leather cases were stretched over a round wooden last so they could keep their shape. Obviously, if they got wet, you needed to stretch them. And that wooden last was 22 inches in circumference. So the ball was clearly a bit smaller than the modern football, which is 27 inches. And the final element of ball preparation that you'll find in the accounts, somewhat surprisingly for a teetotaler like Hope, was whiskey. And that was used to soak and cleanse those raw bladders, the preparation of which was a particularly disgusting process. And keeping the club going was a pretty expensive undertaking. And a lot of the costs are itemized in detail in these club accounts. 3 bladders at 3pence each, 6 laces at a penny each, a tin pipe and wire. Then 8 more bladders, oil, a cloth brush, a canvas bag, yet more bladders, that bottle of whiskey, and the rent for the football field. Total £3, 2 shillings and a penny. And keeping the players supplied with usable footballs was not just expensive, it was a very time-consuming business. And right from the very start of the club, John Hope employed a man or a boy, at this time James Gow, to be in attendance on match days. For a shilling or 1 and 6 a week, his primary job was to blow up the balls and keep replacements handy. He would also prepare the pitch by putting up the goalposts and look after the equipment through the week. So where did they play? Because the other major cost was paying for a pitch. The club had 3 grounds in its existence, all of them beyond the suburbs in the south and west of the city, which is quite a distance from the new town where the members lived, a couple of miles, say. And I guess that indicates just how difficult it was to find somewhere suitable to play. Their first home from 1824 was Dalry Park, not far from Haymarket. It was then an enclosed farm field, leased from a cow feeder called George Spence for 5 shillings and threepence a quarter. Sorry, a month, 5 shillings and threepence a month. That's a quarter guinea. The specific field they used is unknown, and the area is now covered by late Victorian tenements of Dalry Road. We're just going to take a short break for medical assistance. Well, I should explain to those watching online that we had a medical issue. One of the members of the audience was taken ill, but he was able to walk out of the room and is now left. So we can carry on the talk and hopefully everything will be well. So just to carry on, we'd got to the club's first ground in Dalry Park near Haymarket. It was an enclosed farm field leased from a cow feeder called George Spence for 5 shillings and 3 a month. And the specific field they used is unknown. There are several possibilities on the map. And the area itself is now covered by the Victorian tenements of Dalry Road and Caledonian Crescent. Although Dalry House itself, remarkably, has survived. It's still there. It's converted to flats. But the lease for Dalry Park came to an abrupt end in 1831 when there's a rather mysterious receipt in the records when John Hope had to pay 15 shillings for damage, unspecified damages to the park, presumably by boisterous footballers, and the club had to find a new home. So next they settled at Green Hill Park, which is just to the south of Bruntsfield Links, and now covered in upmarket Victorian housing. A lease was drawn up to play year-round. It had previously been mainly a winter game, although they soon found it was considerably more expensive to play in the summer because not only was there a loss of grass feeding for the cows and sheep, which might have cut the grass, they then needed to cut it by hand. So, as this receipt shows, it was £2 a month in the summer to rent the park, but the rest of the year it was just 10 shillings. And then in 1836, they moved to their third and final home, the newly opened Grove Park, also known as Sparks Ground. It was created as the home of Grange Cricket Club by their professional, John Sparks. And it was quite an exciting development for the city. It was Edinburgh's first dedicated enclosed sports ground. John Sparks, who lived in a cottage on the ground, let it out, not just to cricketers, but to a variety of sportsmen, including footballers, athletes, even pigeon shooters. And as far as we know, that's where the club played their last matches. Now, the end came in 1841. We know the club was still active in 1840, as John Hope wrote to the trustees of John Watson's School to ask if the school field might be available for football, but they don't appear to have reached any agreement. The following year, though, it was definitely all over, and this letter from February 1841 is virtually the final item in the club's history. It's a request from John Campbell of 7 Great King Street asking if 3 or 4 of his friends could join. Campbell already knew the club well, having been a member 10 years previously, but he was too late. There's no recorded response, and around that time the football club was wound up. And there's a final single line from John Hope's accountant in April that year, which acknowledges a payment of £4 and 13 shillings and a penny to make up the football deficiency. And that sounds like an effort to close the book. So it's clear that the club had been dwindling for some time, and it also seems that John Hope's domineering organisational skills were a bit of a double-edged sword, because whilst he ran the club meticulously, almost single-handedly, when he wanted to move on, there was no one to take his place. It's a problem football clubs face to this day. Just think of Manchester United and Alec Ferguson and troubles when he left. It's how to replace a dominant figure after his department when he retires. So what happened next? Was that the end or beginning? Can the early footballers in Edinburgh be linked to the development of football as a national sport? Now, the traditional narrative for Edinburgh is that association football only came here in 1873, when Queen's Park played a demonstration match that kick-started the formation of the first clubs in the city. But there's actually a lot going on before then. I'm first to admit there's no straightforward thread straight from John Hope onwards, but and in fact there's little evidence of organised adult football being played in Edinburgh in the 1840s. But there is this wonderful image which features young men playing football on Calton Hill in 1841. We used it on the front cover of our book. And clearly football was a part of everyday life for some people in Edinburgh. And the 1850s onwards certainly witnessed a flourishing of football activity right around the UK, but with Edinburgh again to the fore. And the next significant event here dates from 1851, when the Edinburgh University Football Club challenged the 93rd Highlanders, who were garrisoned in Edinburgh Castle, to a football match in Holyrood Park. The losers agreed to present the winners with a silver medal. And here it is, the world's oldest football prize. It was won by the soldiers, and this wonderful medal is preserved in the Argyll and Sutherland Highlanders Museum. It clearly depicts a kicking, association-type form of football. And it wasn't a one-off because the students played other matches around that time, including one that was a Scotland v England contest. So clearly popular was still popular amongst young men. Then John Hope reappeared as a catalyst for football in 1854 when he opened the Stockbridge playing field in the city next door to Rayburn Place, where the first rugby international was staged 2 decades later. And at his park, which is where Grange Cricket Club now play, he encouraged the boys to play football, writing, "The game is strongly recommended as giving most exercise and fun in a short time." And he also laid down rules of play. And his 1854 printed rules bear similarities, not just going back to his 1833 rules, but also to the future codes for association football. And to highlight some of them, there's no hacking, which is one of the key features of the first laws of association football. The method of scoring is between the posts, as in association football. There's no handling, as in association football. And, of course, the players wear distinctive uniforms to distinguish the teams with different colour caps. And a final insistence on good behaviour. Unfortunately, John Hope couldn't renew his lease of Stockbridge Park, and that inadvertently opened the door to the handling code. And that's because in the very same year, 1854, rugby football established a grip in the city which some would say is never really relinquished. By an accident of fate, a couple of brothers, Alexander and Francis Crombie, who'd earlier been at Merchiston, came back to Edinburgh after a couple of years at Durham School, where they'd been playing football to rugby rules. The younger of the brothers, Francis Crombie, went to Edinburgh Academy just as the school opened its new sports ground, right next door to John Hope's ground. And the fact that he had a little booklet of rules which described how to play the rugby code was very useful. And in essence, that seems to be the catalyst for Edinburgh Academy taking up rugby football. And the other principal schools in the city followed their example. You might think that was when the thread of the creation of association football was broken. But the city's influence continued to be far-reaching. And there are several notable connections, not least the fact that 2 of the men who attended the founding meeting of the Football Association in London in 1863 had learned to play the game when they were at school in Edinburgh. So the founding of the FA wasn't just an English creation. There were 2 Scots there. And I should admit there was also an Australian there for good measure. You can also look at the creation of the Meadows in Edinburgh as a recreation area in the 1850s, because the plans, when it was laid out, made specific mention of providing space for football. So even in the 1850s, clearly the city authorities recognized that this was an important sport. Another interesting aspect is there are several football club members whose sons played football after it was codified in the 1860s and 70s. And if you believe that sons learn from their fathers, that's quite a remarkable legacy. And two of them in particular are worth highlighting. So one link to the next generation is James Kirkpatrick, who was captain of Scotland in the first unofficial football international of 1870, not to mention going on to be an FA Cup winner with Wanderers in 1878. He was a son of Charles Sharp Kirkpatrick, who was a member of the football club in 1831. And in the other code, there's Francis Moncrieff, Scotland's captain in the first international rugby match against England in 1871. He was a son of James Moncrieff, who was a member in 1832. So the captains of the first two Scotland football teams, one in association, one in rugby, were both sons of football club members. And John Hope himself had one last chance to promote the game when association football finally came to Edinburgh in the 1870s, thanks to the missionary efforts of Queen's Park FC. They played a demonstration match in December 1873, and within weeks, John Hope encouraged the soldiers in the 3rd Edinburgh Rifle Volunteers, which he commanded, to form one of the city's first clubs. He kicked off their very first match, and when the Volunteers won their first trophy in 1876, the Edinburgh Shield, it was presented not to the club captain, but to him in recognition of his influence. Taking things a little bit further, members of the 3rd ERV later went on to found St Bernard's FC, who won the Scottish Cup in 1895. So John Hope could really be seen as part of a thread which runs all the way from the formation of his club in 1824 to victory in the National Cup competition in the final decade of the century. But sadly, he wasn't around to see that triumph. When John Hope died in 1893, he was one of the city's richest men, with a fortune which would be worth about £50 million in today's money. And with no children, having never married, he left most of his fortune to the Hope Trust, a religious charity. His extended family, brothers, sisters, nieces, nephews, were somewhat distraught at getting nothing. So they mounted a bitter legal challenge, which claimed, among other things, that he suffered from insane delusions when he wrote his will. It took 6 years going through the courts before the family inevitably lost. And the outcome was that the Hope Trust has continued his work in temperance and religion to this day. Until recently, they were based at 31 Murray Place, his old home, where they stored his archive before passing it on to the National Records of Scotland. And I should say I'm extremely grateful to the Hope trustees for granting permission to use the images from the archive, and of course to the National Records for keeping it going and hosting today's talk. And that's where we come to the end. John Hutchison and I recently published a biography of John Hope and the story of his football club. I hope you maybe heard enough of interest today to think about reading it. And to conclude, John Hope's story isn't just about football. He also impacted on a number of other fields in Edinburgh's story, not without controversy at times. But I hope you'll agree that he deserves particular recognition for his contribution to the early development of football. Because thanks to him, we have the world's first football club, and he should be celebrated as a trailblazer for the game we know and love today. So on the 200th birthday of the club, thank you for listening, and I'll be happy to try and answer any questions you may have.
Thank you very much, Andy. It was a really fascinating talk. Thank you. And I'm happy to take questions. If anyone put their hand up, I can come over with the mic. Does anyone have any questions in the room? Yeah, thank you.
I've heard that the football club has reinvented itself. Is that still going?
No, that seems to be just a short-lived venture. about 10, 15 years ago. It made a few waves at the time, but I don't think it carried on. I wasn't involved.
Thank you. Anyone else? Yeah, we'll come to you.
Thank you. Are you able to say whereabouts in Greyfriars Kirkyard that gravestone was to be found? Do you remember?
Yeah, it's in the... Go to the church, turn right, and it's down the hill on the left. But it's quite a prominent family plot. It's one of these great big ones. That picture I used was just the centre panel, so it's not that hard to find.
Would you say that there was a link between the starting off in Dalry Place, or something it was, and the start of Heart of Midlothian?
No, not at all. Obviously, that side of the city was a hotbed of football, but no, there was no immediate link between the two, sadly.
Thanks, Jess. Was there any relation to Lord Hope, Andy, the proprietor of the meadows at one time?
Yes, it's the same family, but not a direct descendant. I do have in the audience Alec Hope, who can probably tell you more accurately.
We'd say a common ancestor who was Sir Thomas Hope, Lord Advocate for Charles I in the early 1600s.
Okay.
And they're the senior line. The Craig Hall line is the senior line.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So yeah, there were Hopes everywhere. There was quite a big family. And there's lots of places in Edinburgh named after various members of the Hope family.
Hi, I was just intrigued by one of the lines in the rules, and it says, beware of kicking ball over fences, which sounds very much like the rules we used to play when we were kids. You know, you're playing and next to the neighbour's thing, you don't kick the ball over the neighbour's fence, that type of thing, right? It's, you know, it's a I don't know what the right term would be. It's almost like a rule about where you shouldn't kick the ball and like avoid doing stuff.
Yes, the layout of the Stockbridge playground, as it was called at that time, was quite hemmed in. So if you kicked it to the north, it would go into Inverheath Farm, so that's private land. I think there was also a wee burn running along the back at that time. It's now been culverted. There was obviously other people's land either side, so it was a real hassle if you kicked the ball out into somebody else's ground because it wasn't always very easy to get it back. Yes.
Are there any kind of strong claims from anywhere else in the world that they indeed had the first football club? Do you ever hear anything like that come up?
Yes, regularly.
Okay.
There are some very strident claims from Sheffield, because Sheffield FC was founded 1857, and they are recognised by FIFA as the world's oldest club. And they, of course, have the benefit of having a continuous membership. They're still going strong. But I would dispute that they are the first club. And in fact, even before Sheffield, there were one or two other clubs in England which called themselves a football club. So some of them went on to play association football, some went on to play rugby football. But at that time, there was no codification. So it's a fairly meaningless distinction because how they ended up is fairly irrelevant to how they started, which was just playing football according to the rules that they understood in their vicinity at that time.
Do you think people recognise the Edinburgh Football Club as being the oldest?
Well, in some respects they have, because they've already written about it in the FIFA Museum website. So I think the trouble is that there's nobody to hand over a pennant to, like they did in Sheffield. So in their museum, yes, they recognise the importance of the football club. And they agree that it was the first club dedicated to playing football. But beyond that, there's not much that they can do.
Do we have any questions from our online viewers we're able to see there? No. Okay. Anyone else in the room before we wrap things up today? Yeah.
Is it possible that there was teams that have been lost to history that would have been around the same time that we would just don't know about?
Yes, absolutely. And the trouble with history is that you can only go with what is recorded. The only reason we know about this club is because John Hope kept everything. Now, not many people are that careful with their papers. There could be any number of clubs which were active, but either nothing was written down or anything that was written down has been lost. And I made that point about the contemporary newspaper coverage. They were going for 17 years, and there was one single mention in the Caledonian Mercury, and that was of a club dinner. It was probably put in by the publican rather than by the club itself. So if you look in the papers at that time, the newspapers, there's nothing. There is no record of them existing. It's only because John Hope was a bit obsessive about writing things down and keeping it. But good for him for keeping it, but it just means there's a gap. You can never say definitively there was nobody else because there's no evidence yet that there was. And I should say, if you're interested in John Hope's papers, there's a display of the originals here which have been taken out of the archive. So after the talk, if you want to come have a look at them, please feel free.
Thank you. That last question, I think, really gave the importance of records and why we keep them here at the National Records. So I'd like to thank you for your questions and also, obviously, thank Andy once again for his fascinating talk today. Thank you very much for joining us. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.